Hello, this is Darren Pulsifer, Chief Solution Architect of Public Sector at Intel, and welcome to Embracing Digital Transformation, where we investigate effective change leveraging people, process, and technology. On today's episode, shifting from infrastructure to workloads, with special guest Sarah Music, Cloud Solution Architect at Intel. All right, Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Darren.
Hey, Sarah, you were on our show just a couple episodes ago with a big, huge panel of us. And after the show, you said, Darren, I want to do this more. I have more to say.
Yeah, I'm enthusiastic. I think there's a lot to talk about. So yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Well, and especially around the shift from you talking to customers about infrastructure to now talking to customers more about workloads. This is a big trend that you're seeing, right?
Yeah, it's substantial. And just to couch that conversation a little bit, I'm seeing it in a few different ways. One trigger for that obviously has been the obvious shift from the data center to commoditized resources. If you're consuming something as a service, you view it differently. Because of that, we've seen what I think is coming to a zenith, which is the influence of app teams in architectural decisions, because those applications are the lifeblood of these organizations. In a way, even 5-10 years ago, they weren't. So that's another influence. And then, of course, moving forward, from a budgeting perspective, from a FinOps perspective, that's also shifted because you're going to be budgeting by that categorization as opposed to just a raw swath of resources the way you would
that's an interesting shift that you said there, because before, I was a CIO. Before I said, hey, I have my capital budget I spend every year, and people were saying, well, how do you tie that to the individual workloads that you're doing? The cloud model, it's a direct, this workload is using this infrastructure, it's costing me this much.
That's right. Typically, and that can be a real challenge for organizations. One of those things regarding tagging strategies, to what extent you're able to attribute resources, but typically the app teams know because they've either deployed the resources themselves or they've gotten approvals to go ahead and trigger, a development event or something like that. So that actually has helped, I think, in terms of managing and tracking resources, but it's a whole different animal, which is exciting and also challenging.
So what are some of the challenges that you're seeing in this shift from infrastructure to workload balance? What are some of those challenges that you're starting to see?
One is a balance between centralized IT and decentralized. I would say a lot of organizations are both. They're centralized and decentralized because, local teams, smaller teams, perhaps there's an enterprise architect who serves an app team, and people may have been set up in pods, have some leeway in terms of making decisions, in terms of establishing policy, security, governance. Those are typically still handled by centralized IT, or there's a thrust in the organization because they've become so decentralized to have a central hub again, because there's this sense of we have to have a better visibility from an executive presence perspective on what's going. And typically the litmus test, the method that they're using for that is workload or discrete application. It could be a category of workloads, everything that's sitting on top of SQL Server, for instance. But, that's really the shift as opposed to the garden variety, by line of business or by, project. Product owners are playing a new role in that. And by new, I mean the last, 5 years. And it's I think exciting, but also a challenge.
Well, I find it interesting because what you're saying is a lot of the decision making is being pushed down into the organizations that are creating new applications or new services inside IT and also just for customers, right?
Yeah, there's a push and a pull. Some of them hit. A lot of it's been some of it's been pushed down. A lot of it's been pulled down because there's this feeling of we're beholden to a particular schedule to get this resource out for customers. I had a VP of IT tell me, and this was at the top of the pandemic, the market has shifted. Our market has shifted. We're in a competitive situation. We're hearing footsteps. Our app teams are doing really well. And he said, frankly, I'd much rather go in and clean up on the back end after they've successfully deployed these applications than slow them down and potentially put ourselves in jeopardy for the next few quarters.
Wow, that's really interesting. So COVID, we know that COVID was an accelerant, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
absolutely.
But this is interesting. What you're saying here is some IT organizations have said, you know what, let them run. They're running great. We'll clean up on the back end. I think that's really interesting.
I do too. Yeah, especially from a paradigm shift perspective. I think it's unprecedented. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier, I made kind of a joke. We're seeing the death of the chief infrastructure officer and shift back to, and we should say, hey, the CIO is back, the chief information officer is back. But that's only if they start thinking about information and workloads again, instead of, hey, I run a data center. That's what I do as a CIO. Are you seeing that as well? I've joked about that several times on the show, but are you seeing that happening?
I am. And it depends on the organization. We could take it to one extreme and talk about cloud native organizations, or even organizations that have the aspiration to be cloud native. They're refactoring their applications in flight because they really do want to be that agile. And the more they do that, the more it drives toward infrastructure and service of the application, rather than accepting limits potentially that existed in the data center before and working within those parameters. I think, actually once upon a time in that situation, that triggered innovation from app teams because, when you're dealing with a set of givens and that's all you have, sometimes, necessity is the mother of invention. But because we've got sort of infinite possibilities in the cloud, a lot of that's driving back. Now, having said that, that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is what I would call, American heritage corporations, like institutions whose names, we've heard forever and are super well respected. Typically, they have information still on the mainframe, and it's one of those, if it ain't broke, don't fix it scenarios where things are continuing to be served. And especially if you're dealing with applications that are static, convincing a CIO that there's a case to be made to take something in the abstract. Typically people embrace that, but when you actually begin to sit down to put a project together, that's a tougher.
It gets scary, right? You're like, whoa,
it's so scary.
I have 3 guys that know how to keep that mainframe going, and you're telling me you want to touch it? No, we're not going to touch it, right? They get scared, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I understand it, but there is some risk as well, especially as I'm going to call it aging occurs with some of this technology and the technologists that know how to use it. I was talking to the CIO of the patent office today, and they have 3 guys that know Algo, the programming language Algo. And I remember hearing about it. I've never programmed in it. I remember hearing about it in my computer history class, but holy cow.
That is wild.
Yeah, isn't that wild? And they go, yeah, but hey, they've containerized it. I thought, wow, they containerized it and they're running it in the cloud.
That's intense.
That's pretty intense. Yeah, I was like, that's pretty cool, right? That's pretty cool. So we are seeing this shift. So here's a big question. Is Intel worried about this? Because now we become abstracted away. We don't matter as much.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a huge question. And, as somebody who works for Intel, it's one I actually get really excited about because, up until this point, we've spent, the first however long it's been, 10, 15 minutes discussing about what's happening without addressing the underlying processing underneath, but never has it been more relevant about whether what's happening underneath the discrete application been more relevant. Because, one of the things that happens is, are those end users being served? Are those customers being served? Are internal resources, so internal employees, able to do their jobs? If the workload, if the discrete application are running well and running smoothly, that's a job well done, and everybody can move on and be, really pleased. But because of the variety of offerings that there are in the cloud, that's not a given at all. And so a lot of organizations run into, and you hear stories about this all the time, where, their spend ended up being 3x what they thought it was going to be, or performance wasn't what they expected from a latency perspective. And Intel has a huge role to play in addressing some of those concerns, partly because we have mothered those technologies, in many cases that they're sitting on, since we have had such a presence in the cloud for so long, but also because we're one of the biggest software companies out there. A lot of people don't realize that about us, and so we've had to essentially bake our own bread and eat it. And so there's a lot of internal knowledge, I think, that can be brought to bear.
So what you're telling me is, because I heard it was a little bit alluded to, not all of the instances in the cloud are created equal.
That's right.
Right. So, and we've optimized our workloads internally to get the most out of the cloud instances that we are using.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's part of it. I mean, instance selection is super important, and at that point, of course, we're talking about infrastructure as a service. I think platform as a service, there's still a conversation to be had there, because for a lot of services, you get to pick what's underneath. I'll give you an example of, a real life example I saw with a customer. They were looking to move to Azure. There was a legacy application in the environment. There were a lot of conversations about what was to be done with this application. Only 2 people used it, which sounds like not important. But if
it's important to those 2 people, right?
Well, and if that application went down, Walmart didn't get their wholesale discount from this corporation.
Oh.
So all of a sudden, in terms of impact, only 2 people may use it, but that's a big that's a big risk if you're going to take an application like that and not really have a really ironclad path to, for what to do with it. Part of what I think we do at Intel, first off, is not only just the reputation of trust and exactitude that we have in the market from a processing perspective, but from a performance perspective, especially per dollar when you're looking at architecting an entire solution. There's really very little that you can argue with in terms of what we could do with an application like that, both from a stability perspective and SLA perspective, optimization. So even beyond the instance selection, the tool sets that we could offer customers who would have an application like that. I mean, it's really it opens up a whole new wonderful can of opportunity.
So that's a really interesting question that just popped into my head. I can still use Intel silicon optimization even in the cloud.
Mm-hmm. In a lot of cases, yeah, absolutely. And
okay, I think a lot of people don't know that.
Yeah, that's really important. And one aspect of that, having said that, is infrastructure as a service. Yes, and it's one of those things where talk to us and tell about where, because it depends on the cloud provider, and it depends on what particular instance you're looking at, exactly what in the way of our optimizations would be available. But Kubernetes and Docker, that's a huge one. A lot of people are moving things to Kubernetes clusters, and we have a ton of optimizations around that. Again, partly because, of work that we've done internally, but also because, if we're going to help customers, we want, regardless of where they are, we want customers to have the best experience on our processors possible. And if we can take things beyond the standard Helm charts with extensions that would look at, the health of the node underneath, and not just raw availability, but what's healthfully available. There are a lot of things that can be done. And again, who would have thought? I know a lot of people who are just native in the cloud have no idea that Intel offers these things, but we do.
So
we're doing it too.
Are we talking just like a couple percentage points improvement, or is it substantial? Are we talking 30, 40%?
It varies wildly, but part of it is I would say the snowballing effect of layering these things. So first off, you might have an optimization that's going to capture 10%. If you're looking at the lifeblood of an environment over the course of the year, that's actually significant.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
You're looking at a 10%, but it goes up from there. I mean, if you're looking at the efficiency of a Kubernetes cluster, if we're driving up toward 30, 40%, that's real. That's real.
Yeah.
That's real from a time perspective. That's real from an uptime perspective. That's real from a dollars perspective. From a speed perspective, that's really important. So it can be pretty meaningful. We're not talking about not beating your head against the wall for 5 hours and getting like 2 or 3%. This is
it's substantial then. So, all right, here's another question. You're a cloud solution architect at Intel. So, does every workload go into the cloud?
No, I don't think so. I think there are a lot, but I think there are a lot that are still better. And a lot of it has to do with organization.
Oh, so you're saying the organizational structure may actually have more of an impact on where workload lands?
Yes. I definitely think so. Some of it's an upskilling perspective.
Yeah.
Some of it has to do with how their current, assets are architected in the data center. If we're looking at, a TCO of the application, SLAs, things like that. I had a financial organization tell me, we always have to be ready for a Katrina-like event. If something happens, customers still have to have access to us, which makes a lot of sense. And there are situations in which, and I think this is pretty common consensus in the industry, the data center's not, for the most part, going completely away. So then it becomes a question about what and when do we move? And it's true. I mean, I'm obviously a fan of the public cloud. I wouldn't be doing the job I'm doing
you're a
if
CSA,
I wasn't.
right?
Right. That would be a real. I'd be so conflicted within myself if I didn't really have a lot of buy-in there. But it's true. I think from a credibility standpoint, as a CSA anywhere, you have to be candid and look at a workload or an application.
So you have to be honest with yourself.
You
right?
do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you believe in the cloud smart
Yeah.
type of mentality, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, what about multi-cloud? There's lots of different ways to think of multi-cloud. What's your perspective on multi-cloud?
I think it's again, as it does with so many good things, it depends. But some of what I'm seeing is that a really successful multi-cloud strategy is, from a CSP perspective, having a primary and having a secondary. A lot of people, when they talk about multi-cloud, the implication behind that is fear of vendor lock-in, which I'm really sympathetic to. Having said that, with data gravity, where the majority of your data lives, that is going to have a bearing. And the other thing is, it is difficult if you look at it and say, we really are going to have 3 co-equal presences in AWS, Azure, and GCP. If you have workloads or applications that are architected in such a way that, whether you realize it or not, is really a better fit for one or the other, you're kind of wanting to hammer a square peg into a round hole in some situations. So there is some discernment that goes into it, and it's not a short process. There are organizations who I think are pretty successful, but it's usually because the applications were built in that cloud provider. So they were greenfield to begin with in that cloud provider. Because I think a lot of people look at the cloud like a buffet. Look at all the choices. Look at all the, okay, I want BigQuery from Google. I want this over here from Amazon, which can work, but egress is one thing that you're looking at if you have a lot shifting back and forth from these cloud providers, and then of course data gravity. Yeah, and you're also risking latency, even if everything's in the same region. It's not sitting next to whatever it's calling for data warehousing or whatever. So they're just it's a with new opportunity and with new choice comes complication and sometimes a little bit of risk. But so that's a lot of what I've seen, that usually a primary and a secondary works really well.
So let's talk about if let's say I'm a CIO, Intel approaches me and said, hey, we got all these cloud solution architects. What's your first engagement with them look like? Tell me what that's like.
A lot of it's just discovery. What are you looking to do? And, asking what kind of initiatives you have, sort of what's the thorn in your side, because sometimes, certainly from an Intel perspective, some of those things can be remediated with things that we have pretty closely to, at our fingertips, and people just didn't know to ask questions. So I think historically, and I think we're becoming more agile about this, and we're doing a really good job of turning this. We have so much that we do that sometimes we've come to the customer and said, look at this amazing array. What do you want? And we haven't contextualized it.
Yeah.
It is. Yeah, we haven't contextualized it. And so we're learning, especially in the CSA team, learning to do that for the customer based on, kind of what we're seeing from what they're describing, being able to kind of peel out a subset of what would really be relevant in that case. And it makes things faster. It, I think, brings delight to who we work with more quickly, because sometimes you're opening up the pressure valve. You're able to let off some steam because there's an answer that was unlooked for. Who doesn't love that?
You almost sound like a therapist. Are you a technology therapist? Is that, maybe that should be a better name for what you guys do?
Right. There is a component of that.
Yeah, because I've experienced it myself. People, they confide in you about their technical woes, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I'm here to, talk you off the ledge or whatever it is, which does happen in the technology realm.
It really does. And I'll say too, so there is a lot of that, even in organizations where we've walked in and there's been a team that's been pretty confident, like maybe has a little bit of strut going on about, we've got this figured out, you can't tell us anything new. There have been a lot of times when we've been able to, just because we're, as an organization, we're so plugged in, because we're right there at the foundation of it all. So
do you also see yourself as an educator in a lot of respects?
Have to be, absolutely, which is a joy to me, from personally, my background. I think really good customer advocates have to be teachers, and that's, I think, from a business standpoint, that's become more and more a thrust that I've seen even through COVID. Again, not to belabor that, but
no, you're right.
Over communicating, because we can't stand at the water cooler, so to speak, and have conversations about these things. Just making sure everybody has the information that they need to move forward.
Hey, Sarah, this has been wonderful talking to you today. Thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. I think it's insightful to hear you're in the trenches, you're doing this day to day, and to hear the shift that you're starting to see. I think it's wonderful.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Embracing Digital Transformation today. If you enjoyed our podcast, Give it 5 stars on your favorite podcasting site or YouTube channel. You can find out more information about Embracing Digital Transformation at embracingdigital.org. Until next time, go out and do something wonderful.